Security and author of the new book, The Hidden Hand. It chronicles the post-World War II development of the British and American intelligence agencies and the evolution of the Cold War. This History on Book TV program runs 50 minutes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Barnes & Noble in Georgetown. My name is Greg Schreiner, and I'm the Community Relations Manager. I want to thank everyone in attendance and thank those of you who are watching on C-SPAN this evening on Book TV. Tonight, we will discuss the book, The Hidden Hand, Britain, America, and Cold War Secret Intelligence, published by Overlook Press. The book takes an in-depth and gripping look at the special relationship and cooperation intelligence collection between British and the United States during the Cold War era. Richard J. Aldrich began the research for this book here in Georgetown at Georgetown University. He is the co-editor of the journal Intelligence and National Security. Currently, he is a professor of politics at the University of Nottingham, and it is our pleasure to welcome him back to Georgetown. And we welcome to the podium Mr. Richard J. Aldrich. Richard.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be back in Georgetown and given an opportunity to talk about my new book, The Hidden Hand. I'm talking about this book which deals largely with intelligence during the Cold War, and essentially it surveys the dramatic new releases which have appeared in the British and in the American archives about the hidden hand of intelligence during the Cold War. This is the result of both the Clinton Initiative in 1995, which released a large body of new intelligence records into the American archives, and a similar initiative in the UK, which resulted equally in the declassification of many thousands of pages of hitherto highly classified documents in the United Kingdom. But I should say that many of you may have questions about intelligence and the current situation. I'd be happy to take questions about that and how that relates to the lessons of the Cold War as my presentation progresses. What I want to do this evening is talk about the way in which new declassified documents have changed our understanding of the Cold War. What sort of different perspectives have they provided? How has this changed our understanding of a conflict which lasted for nearly 50 years? The first thing I want to say is that these new documents show that the secret intelligence Cold War was much more violent than we have hitherto understood it to be. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that British and American attempts to run agents inside the communist bloc were essentially disastrous. It was very, very difficult to run agents inside the Soviet Union, inside Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, and inside communist China, and also inside places like Korea. And it's now very clear that the vast majority of agents that the West tried to run inside these areas in the 1950s and the 1960s were rounded up, imprisoned, often tortured, and sadly, in some cases, shot. What we need to understand is how very difficult it was to put someone inside the Eastern Bloc and make them into a convincing agent. One story which I've come across during the researching of this book involves the problem of forging internal passports, which would allow you to travel around as a spy inside the Eastern Bloc. The British and the Americans went to enormous lengths to manufacture the kind of terrible low-quality paper, to forge the kind of paper which was used inside the Eastern Bloc for these internal passports, which any normal Soviet citizen would require to move from one part of the Soviet Union to another. To travel on a train 100 miles, you would need one of these internal passports. British and Americans went to great lengths to make the kind of terrible low-grade paper that characterized these passports, and they got it right. They hired the best forgers. In some cases they were German, but the thing they got wrong were the staples. What they put into these passports were Western staples which were high-tech. They were covered in a resin. What it meant was you could bury one of these staples in the ground for 50 years, you could dig it up, it wasn't rusty. Very different to a Russian staple. A Russian staple is just a piece of wire. And if you put that piece of wire into an internal passport, put it inside your coat pocket, carry it around for 3 months, what happens? Perspiration radiation, dampness, heat. Within 3 months, you have a rust stain running through the middle of your internal passport. And so all the KGB had to do was open up these passports, which were beautifully forged, but look for the ones which did have the rust stains inside, and round those people up. By the 1970s, the British and the American secret services were trying to manufacture Russian fluff to go in the bottom of the pockets of their agents they were putting into Moscow. That's how dangerous it was. Now, as you can imagine, as the CIA and the British MI6 began to lose agents, they became rather embittered by this, and they were looking for an opportunity to get back at the Eastern Bloc. And the opportunity to get back at the Eastern Bloc came along relatively quickly. In 1948 and 1949, Stalin began to purge the Eastern Bloc, looking for deviant communists. Stalin was incredibly suspicious, even more suspicious than we originally suspected he was. Stalin once said famously in the early 1950s, "I don't trust anybody anymore, not even myself." By 1948, by 1949, he was beginning to purge Eastern Europe, looking for communist deviants, people who were not properly pro-Soviet. And the CIA and MI6, the British Secret Service, and also the American Policy Planning Staff detected an opportunity. What they decided to do was to run deception operations. Deception operations had been some of the most successful Western intelligence operations of the Second World War. They'd shielded the D-Day troops from German defences very successfully, and now the CIA and MI6 ran deception operations to smear many innocent, genuinely pro-Soviet communists with the taint of collaboration with the CIA and MI6. In the 1960s, Alan Dulles claimed that he had done this. Alan Dulles was head of the CIA. He claimed this was one of the CIA's most effective operations. Most people did not believe him. But now these new documents show that genuinely both CIA and the MI6 successfully smeared many hundreds of East European communists, and these people were therefore suspected of collaborating with the West. They were rounded up, they were imprisoned, in some cases they were shot. Quite remarkable. It's clear that some of the Politburos of these East European communist parties, the Bulgarians, the Hungarians, the Czechs, in some cases over a third of their number were rounded up, imprisoned, tortured, and in some cases shot. A very violent perspective upon the Cold War, and one we hitherto hadn't understood. That really, I think, would be my first observation, that the Cold War was much more violent. I'd also suggest that it's much more dangerous. British and American intelligence collaborated very closely during the Cold War. But what these documents now show us is that the British and the Americans collaborated on intelligence because they didn't fully trust each other. When the British and the Americans were collaborating over intelligence, it was partly to allow them to watch each other. Why were they watching each other? Because both the British and the Americans at different times in the late 1940s and the early 1950s suspected each other of trying to trigger a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Why was this? First of all, in 1948. In 1948, the Americans had the bomb. The Soviets did not. And what American intelligence officers realized was that within a few years, the Soviets would have the bomb. And when the Soviets had the bomb, the British position would be very risky indeed. And so it made sense to American intelligence officers that if there was going to be a war, from the British perspective, it was actually more attractive to have the war now in 1948, before the Soviets had a bomb, before they could destroy the United Kingdom, rather than later on, when the Soviets were nuclear armed. And so in 1948, when the British began to fly extremely risky spy reconnaissance missions over the Soviet Union, American intelligence officers began to scratch their heads and said, what's going on here? Why are the British being allowed to fly these flights? Why are they taking a very strong stand over the Berlin crisis, which the British were? This doesn't make sense unless the British are trying to provoke a war with the Soviet Union with the idea that nuclear weapons will be used against the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union can use nuclear weapons against the West. And this is certainly what many mid-ranking American Air Force intelligence officers suspected in 1948. By the early 1950s, the boot was on the other foot. British intelligence officers suspected that the Americans were planning a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union. And this time it was because at this point in the early 1950s, the United States had nuclear weapons, the Soviets had nuclear weapons, but the Soviets had not yet developed a delivery system which would allow them to attack the Soviet Union. And what British intelligence officers were saying, well, surely the Americans must be thinking, if there's going to be a war, and many people in the early 1950s believed war was inevitable, if there's going to be a war, then it makes sense for the Americans to go for war now, before the Soviet Union can hit the United States. And indeed, what we now know is, not only were the British very worried about this, not only were they using their intelligence links to track American thinking along these lines, but we also know that many American intelligence officers were indeed, many American Air Force planning officers were indeed thinking along these lines, because strategically it made sense. It didn't make sense for the United States to wait until the Soviets had an H-bomb and could deliver that to the United States. And so what we now know is that the Cold War looks much more dangerous. It looks much more dangerous not only because of these windows of opportunity which intelligence officers were tracking, but it also looks more dangerous because some of the intelligence operations which were launched were themselves provocative. What we've discovered in the last few years is that one of the U-2 flights during the Cuban Missile Crisis probably brought the Western world closer to nuclear disaster than any other operation during the Cold War. This was not a U-2 flight over Cuba. This was instead a U-2 aerial reconnaissance flight, a routine aerial reconnaissance flight, which was tracked along the Siberian coast, the coast near the Arctic Circle, and its task was to detect the remnants of Soviet atomic tests. It was a routine flight. These flights were called sniffer flights. And what they did was they simply gathered the remnants in the atmosphere of Soviet tests, and from those collections you could discover quite a lot about the Soviet A-bomb and their Soviet developments. Now, nobody had thought to cancel these flights during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when everybody was on a very high state of alert. These intelligence flights rolled on as they had done day after day, month after month, without anybody really giving them another thought. What happened at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that one of these U-2 aircraft went off course. It was flying near the Arctic Circle, its compass and gyro didn't work properly, and instead of flying around the sea area, around the edge of Siberia and the Arctic, it began to head inland over the Soviet Union at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, what were the Soviets in Moscow thinking as this U-2 flight began to head in on their radar screens over the Soviet Union? What they thought was that no one in their right minds would put a U-2 up over the Soviet Union at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That would not make sense. That would be an irrational thing to do. The only possibility, the only rational possibility, the only rational interpretation of what was going on was that this was the pre-strike reconnaissance by the Americans before they launched a nuclear attack. The only interpretation which Moscow could put upon this was it was the initial stages of an American first strike. Panic right across Washington. What to do? The first thing that happened was that the Soviets scrambled some fighters to try and shoot down the U-2. The Americans scrambled some fighters to protect the U-2, and because of the very high state of alert, those fighters were armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, because that's what happens when you go to that stage of readiness. And the people in command and control of those nuclear weapons were the pilots flying the aircraft who had the authority to launch. Now, fortunately, the U-2 made its way back. It was escorted by the American fighters, and they didn't meet the Soviet fighters, and there wasn't a confrontation. But what we now know is that because Moscow was thinking, gosh, what is this U-2 flight all about? And was thinking about how to react to the possibility of an American first strike, the only logical thing for the Soviets to do, having detected what looks like an American first strike, was to try and get their strike in first. In that situation, it's the only logical thing to do. And people in the Pentagon in Washington who were looking at this situation developing were extremely anxious. Senior officials thought they were going to die on that day, and they thought they were going to die on that day for two reasons. Firstly, because they thought the Soviets would misunderstand what was going on, and they thought the Soviets would launch a first strike to try and get in first. And for a second reason, because they knew that once the Air Force generals discovered what was going on, the American Air Force generals would say, this is a terrible mistake, but given that the Soviets are probably about to launch a first strike, the only thing that we can do is to try and get in ahead of them. And that reveals some very interesting things about intelligence and deterrence. It reveals that intelligence operations can be provocative. They can be dangerous. They're not always common. And I think it also shows that deterrence, while it's stable, is very stable, but once it becomes unstable, the incentive to get your strike in first can be dangerous. Indeed, it can be almost overwhelming. And again, the Cold War looks much more dangerous than we first thought it to be. What we also know is that intelligence agencies down the years have tried to tell us that intelligence makes the world more stable. Know the truth, and the truth will make you free. In other words, intelligence services serve policymakers, open their eyes to things which they hadn't previously understood, and mutual understanding on the part of both sides provided by intelligence services makes the world more stable. That is the story that we've been sold down the years, and some of that is true. There's no doubt that Eisenhower had his eyes open to the bomber gap and the missile gap by the intelligence agencies. But what we also know is now that there are moments where intelligence agencies contributed to crises as well as helped to resolve them. What we now know is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, some of the analysts who were serving during the Cuban Missile Crisis say that had American intelligence known all the things it wanted to know and all the things that were going on during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States would almost certainly have attacked Cuba. So there again you can see that intelligence can make the world more stable, but it can also make the world more dangerous. Now, I've said that intelligence certainly made the Cold War more violent. It certainly made it more dangerous. I would argue that the Cold War now looks much more duplicitous as a result of intelligence during the Cold War. We can see that lots of different states, particularly European states, were playing all sides during the Cold War. And I can demonstrate this no more clearly than by the case of the Italians. The Italians are particularly interesting at the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War. Why are the Italians interesting? The Italians were brilliant code breakers. They were very good at reading people's codes. During the Second World War, they read some British codes, they read some American codes, they read lots and lots of different codes because they were brilliant code breakers. So what happens to the Italians as the Italians begin to drop out of the war? In 1943, as you know, Italy surrendered to the Allies. What happened to the Italian code breakers? The Italian code breakers were very talented, and they were paid by the Germans to join the Germans and to fight on beyond the Italian surrender of 1943. So the Italian code breakers, instead of surrendering in 1943 to the Allies, moved north and joined the Germans and continued to break all sorts of Allied codes right up until the end of the war. At the end of the war, what happens to the Italian code breakers? There's a particularly good unit of Italian code breakers commanded by Major Barbieri. They're reading all kinds of stuff. They're absolute wizards at the code-breaking game. Do the British and Americans put them into prison? Absolutely not. The British and Americans hire them immediately. They've been working for the Germans. Now they're working for the British and the Americans. The interesting question is, by 1946, this Italian code-breaking unit, very talented, who are they working? Who are they working against? They're now working for the British and Americans. They were working against the British and Americans last year. Who have the British and Americans hired them to work against? One would immediately say the Russians. but we'd be wrong. The Italian code breakers are hired by the British and the Americans to work against the French. They're breaking French codes. They're breaking the codes of the French ambassador in Washington, who's communicating with Paris, and they're breaking the codes of the French ambassador in Moscow, who's communicating with Paris. And the British and Americans are desperate to know what's going on, because they suspect the French, as always, are playing some kind of double game, or perhaps collaborating with the Russians. After about a year of breaking French codes on the part of the British and Americans, the Allies, the British and Americans, are really very impressed by what Barbieri's unit are doing, and they send him a congratulatory telegram saying, "You've been doing a splendid job." Barbieri, talented but also self-effacing, says, "Yes, we're very talented, but we're not the most talented Italian code breakers. The most talented Italian code breakers have been hired by the French, and they're working for the French." And that gives you a picture of what the Cold War looks like. Not two-sided, not three-sided, but multifaceted, and in many cases, some of these allies playing a double game. I think another example of that would be the British. The British, I think, were sometimes very interested in the Cold War, but most of British intelligence was deployed against a much older enemy. The old British enemy is the continual decline of the British Empire. And so where British interests and British Empire interests ran across or cut across the interests of the Cold War, the British preferred to keep their empire afloat rather than vigorously fight the Cold War. And this can be demonstrated no more clearly than in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was absolutely on the front line of the Cold War. And the British had a very large spy base in Hong Kong, and the Americans had an enormous spy base. The Americans had what was called the American Consulate. This American consulate, well, you often think of a consulate as being one diplomat, two diplomats, three diplomats and a dog. In the American consulate in Hong Kong, there were 600 American officials, many of them CIA. This was one of the largest diplomatic outposts in the world, but for cover purposes, it was still called a consulate and not an embassy. Now, British intelligence was playing a curious game here, because on the one hand, the Allies were fighting in Korea. They were subsequently fighting in Vietnam. They were continually at daggers drawn with the Chinese, but the British wanted to protect their empire in Hong Kong, and under no circumstances did they want to provoke the communist Chinese. What did this mean? This meant the British were really rather lax about imposing trade restrictions against the communists in China. If the communists in China wanted to buy things from Hong Kong, the British were keen to sell them, even if it meant these supplies were making their way to the communists during the Korean War. And one of the most interesting examples of this is the efforts of the CIA and other American intelligence officials to track the supply of condoms on their way to the Chinese communists through Hong Kong in the early 1950s. Why was the Pentagon anxious about the supply of condoms to the communist Chinese? Because they'd heard reports that in Korea, the communist Chinese forces were using condoms to protect the muzzles of their guns from moisture and rust. And so condoms were perceived by the Pentagon as useful weapons of war for the communist forces opposing the Allies in Hong Kong. And so for a while, CIA officials, other American officials based in Hong Kong, were racing around Hong Kong, trying to track these illegal supplies of condoms that were making their way across the border through Hong Kong to the communist Chinese. And then, about 2 months later, the Pentagon discovered that actually if you put a condom over the muzzle of a gun, what actually happens is moisture builds up. The gun doesn't slow down in terms of rusting, it actually rusts faster. Using a condom to protect your gun actually is detrimental to the performance of the gun. And so messages came out of Washington, D.C., over to the Americans in Hong Kong, stop tracking the supply of condoms, encourage the supply of condoms to the communist Chinese, because it actually undermines the communist war effort. Much more serious was the problem of intelligence collaboration. Hong Kong was actually a battleground between British intelligence on the one hand and the intelligence services of Taiwan, which were being backed by the CIA in Taipei. What Taiwan was trying to do was to come into Hong Kong and disrupt communist networks in Hong Kong and launch operations from Hong Kong into mainland China. One of the most dramatic examples of this was an attempt to assassinate Chou En-lai in 1955. In 1955, Chou En-lai was making his way to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. He was supposed to get on a particular airliner. This airliner passed through Hong Kong. There, an agent of Taiwan's Secret Service put a bomb on board, and that airliner was destroyed off the coast of Indonesia in 1955 with the loss of all people travelling on it. Chou En-lai actually got warning of this plot before it occurred, and he chose not to travel on that airliner. What actually happened when the airliner was shot down? What actually happened was British intelligence began to, it was actually an Indian airliner, British intelligence collaborated with Indian intelligence and Chinese communist intelligence to try and track the Taiwan Secret Service, which was being armed and trained by the CIA. A very curious situation in terms of Allied relations, and certainly resulted in all kinds of curious frictions. Well, those are some of the interesting stories which are coming out of these newly released documents. The Cold War looks more dangerous, it looks more violent, it looks more duplicitous. But what we're also beginning to discover is that we still don't know a great deal about the intelligence aspect of the Cold War. Some material has been released, but what we also know is a great deal has not yet been released, and far more remains to be released than has currently been made available to us. What kind of things represent the missing dimensions of the Cold War? What are the things that we still don't know? What I think we still don't understand is that military intelligence activities by the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force were actually much bigger and probably much more dangerous than many of the operations run by the secret services that we know best. For example, we think of the CIA as being the big intelligence player during the Cold War. In fact, Army, Navy, Air Force were running much bigger operations, and in some cases, much more successful operations. One of those interesting operations is something called Operation Terrorist. This was a military intelligence operation run by British Army Intelligence, American Army Intelligence, and French Army Intelligence. What did it consist of? What it consisted of was essentially a curious situation in Germany, which of course was divided between East and West, where the West were allowed to put military liaison missions into East Germany for the purpose of maintaining good relations, and the Soviets were allowed a limited number of Soviet Army liaison officers into West Germany. And of course, within a couple of years, these liaison missions became essentially legitimate spying missions. Instead of doing liaison, they spent most of their time sneaking around and gathering intelligence. And these were highly successful operations. One of the most successful aspects of these operations was the gathering of rubbish. And the most interesting rubbish that the British and the Americans, French gathered was used Soviet toilet paper. Why were the British and the American and the French intelligence officers skulking around East Germany collecting used toilet paper? For a very simple reason. The Soviet army had rather low standards, did not look after its soldiers particularly well. And one of the things it did not give its Soviet army soldiers was toilet paper. And so when the Soviet army was in the field, the Soviet army used anything it could get its hands on. All kinds of paper, newspaper, in many cases, secret documents, in some cases, top secret documents. They used pages from manuals for the latest equipment. They used code and cipher materials because that was all that was available in the field. Now, from the point of view of the British and American and French intelligence officers, the exercise areas where the Soviet army were holding their exercises, these were off limits. They were off limits during the exercises and for about a week after the exercises were over. But as soon as the exercises were over, Operation Terrorist sprung into action. And the British and the Americans and the French scurried across the training areas with their bags collecting these documents that were unattractive on one level, but on another level, extremely attractive. to the intelligence analysts of the Western world. And the intelligence agencies of the British and the French and the Americans enjoyed forwarding these documents to very high-level officials for their inspection. This was a supremely successful operation. It ran for almost the entire length of the Cold War without being discovered. One of the most fascinating aspects and rather gruesome aspects of this story, I think, was during the Afghanistan War. During the Afghanistan War, we know the Soviet army was under extreme pressure. And in order to hide some of the casualties from the Soviet population, what the Soviet army were doing was sending some of its casualties from the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s to East German hospitals. Instead of sending them back to Moscow, instead of sending them back to Russia, they sent them to East Germany in order to disguise the level of casualties that they were suffering. Western intelligence wanted to know what kind of pressure the Afghanistan war was putting on the Soviet war machine. What was the morale like of Soviet soldiers who had been wounded? And what they wanted was correspondence to and from home. From these Soviet casualties to these Soviet casualties, what was the Soviet Union making of the kind of pressure that the Afghanistan war was putting on them? And so Operation Terrorist was put into gear again, but this time the targets were the waste paper bins of the East German military hospitals, trying to get documents, trying to get letters to and from home. And as Western intelligence officials raided these bins, to their dismay, what they discovered was that East German military hospitals were very primitive, and they didn't have a system for separating out sanitary waste from the operating theatre from their paper waste. And so as they began to delve into these bins, they found everything, not just paper waste, but also all kinds of medical stuff, and indeed amputated arms and limbs which had come off these poor Soviet soldiers who suffered in the Afghanistan war. Within days, Western intelligence officials contacted London and Washington and said, we really don't like doing this, these bins are pretty unpleasant, and it's not a very nice thing to root through. A telegram came back saying, actually, we'd really like to know what kind of shrapnel is doing the damage in Afghanistan, so if you could possibly recover the odd arm or leg, we would really like one or two of those things. And so, unfortunately, Western intelligence officials were required to recover some rather gruesome intelligence artifacts from the bins of the East German military hospitals, and these were sent on their way for analysis in the West. I have to say that after a few weeks, intelligence officials on the ground objected rather stiffly to this kind of work, and that operation was fairly quickly drawn to a halt. So these kind of operations done by Army, Navy and Air Force intelligence people are very large, are very important, and we know very little about them. Many of the secret intelligence services run by the British military, run by the Pentagon, remain hidden from us. At that time, they remain hidden from us now. There's a Pentagon intelligence organization that was once called Intelligence Support Activity. It's changed its name several times. It's so secret that that name is not known to us now. Many of these services are more secret than the CIA, and indeed they remain hidden from public vision now as they did at that time. The other aspect of the Cold War that we still don't know about is signals intelligence. Signals intelligence remains almost completely absent from the Cold War archive. We know that secret reading of codes and communications completely changed our understanding of the Second World War. In the 1970s, we began to find out about Ultra. We began to understand how people like Eisenhower, people like Omar Bradley, had their entire vision of the West European campaign changed by being able to read German communications. And in the 1970s and in the 1980s, as we became aware of the ultra-secret, we had to more or less completely rewrite our history of the Second World War. But we still don't know about code-breaking during the Cold War. Why don't we know about code-breaking during the Cold War? Well, I think for two reasons. Firstly, the agencies which conducted Cold War code-breaking remain far and away the most secret. The National Security Agency is even more secret than the CIA and has refused to declassify almost any documents about the Cold War, and its British partner GCHQ is equally conscious about secrecy. There's another reason why we don't know, and that has to do with the control of the code-breaking documents themselves. When these secret agencies broke the codes, what did they do with it? They handed those secret documents to the policymakers in the State Department and the Pentagon, but they circulated them in a special way. All code-breaking documents had to be handled by a particular person called a communications security officer. That person passed them around in specially coloured folders. They were not allowed to mingle these code-breaking documents with ordinary documents, and when they'd been read, they were taken back in by this person. They were taken back to the code-breaking agency, the National Security Agency. They were pulped, and they were turned into pizza boxes. If you want to know where the most secret documents of the Cold War are now, look at all the pizza boxes that are scattered around Washington in the dumpsters. That's where the secret documents are now. In the 1980s, the National Security Agency built a recycling plant to deal with all these documents, these very, very secret documents that had been around the Pentagon, been around the State Department, but had been returned for pulping. In the 1980s, the National Security Agency were pulping 30 tons of classified documents a day. I can assure you that 30 tons of documents, that is a very substantial amount of documents. If a historian set out to read 30 tons of documents, it would probably take them a lifetime. It would take them a lifetime to read the product of the National Security Agency for just one day. In other words, if I set out to write the history of the National Security Agency and I was allowed to read all these highly classified documents, I could only write a history which was one day in the life of the National Security Agency. That is the scale of the secret output of these agencies, and that is the scale of the secret archive which remains hidden from us. We may never see that secret archive. And really that's the note that I want to close on. What do we know about Secret Service during the Cold War? What story does the book The Hidden Hand have to tell us? Well, I think one of the most intriguing stories is that Cold War secret intelligence is like an iceberg. At the moment, we can see some of it, we can glimpse the top of it, but most of it lurks in the darkness, unseen, down below, unseen, and for the time being, secret, mysterious, and as yet completely unrevealed to us. In that sense, what The Hidden Hand says is, here are some of the most exciting secrets that have been revealed to us, but actually the majority of the story has yet to be revealed. One of the most famous historians of the Cold War published a book a few years ago called We Now Know. That book suggested that with the opening of archives from the Kremlin, from the Eastern Bloc, and also to some extent from Beijing, we were beginning to understand the true nature of the Cold War. The Hidden Hand has a different story to tell. The Hidden Hand story is really to suggest that we don't yet know. We don't yet know the full story of the Cold War, and perhaps we will never know the full story of the Cold War. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and take a couple questions. First, bring us into what's happening today in the news with the intelligence gathering, terrorist organizations, and where the challenges governments of America and Britain have between intelligence gathering from non-governmental groups such as the terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and formal governments like Soviet.
Well, I think what we've seen over the last few weeks and months, it is actually some remarkable successes. September the 11th, I think, is portrayed as an intelligence failure. The verdict is still out on that. Information is still being gathered. I think we'll have to wait weeks, months, perhaps years to know the true story of what actually happened in terms of the intelligence background to September the 11th. And I think it's important not to rush to judgment on that particular issue. What I think is clear is that the intelligence war in Afghanistan has been supremely successful. What we've seen is intelligence supporting an extremely difficult military campaign, a campaign in an area in which the Soviets were defeated, and in which the Allies have largely been victorious. And a great deal of that has to do with the fantastic intelligence support which the Allies have had in the war in Afghanistan. That reflects partly technology, supreme technology, tremendous application of what's called tech-in, but it also reflects something else. It reflects the old-fashioned human spy on the ground. What we have seen in Afghanistan is not just the CIA and the British MI6 paving the way for special forces. When the special forces arrive, there's normally a British MI6 officer or a CIA officer on the ground who's already scouted the place out, welcoming them in, giving the key intelligence on Al-Qaeda and allowing them to get busy and actually kill Al-Qaeda units. So there has been a very important intelligence effort to lead those military activities to actually destroy Al-Qaeda units on the ground. That's received a lot of publicity, and we've actually seen CIA special forces on our TV screens, and that's really been quite a remarkable first. What I think that's distracted our attention away from is that CIA and SIS have been doing, or MI6 have been doing all sorts of other important work on the ground. What else have they been doing? They've been doing very important political influence operations. Afghanistan is a very peculiar place. It's a place where politics are extremely raw and where different groups change sides with bewildering frequency. And essentially what CIA and SIS have been doing on the ground is building political support for the new regime in Kabul. And what that means in many cases is persuading these groups to join the Allies using all kinds of time-honoured methods. And in some cases that simply means that secret intelligence officers, CIA officers have gone in there with very, very large bundles of cash and have paid for various factions to join the Allied side. That may seem shocking to us, but actually politics in Afghanistan is extremely raw, extremely basic, and those kind of political influence operations have been as important as the military operations in terms of turning the corner and bringing that operation to a successful conclusion. Now, looking at intelligence in the broader context, I think there are certainly some things that we need to fix. And I'd argue there are three things that are kind of on the agenda in terms of the future of Allied intelligence, particularly the future of American intelligence. I think the first thing is control. One of the problems in the American intelligence system is that there's no central control. The United States once had a central controller of intelligence. His name was William J. Donovan. He came along during the Second World War. He was appointed by Roosevelt to an office called Controller of Information, right at the start of the Second World War. William J. Donovan was America's first Controller of Information, and arguably he was the last, because as American intelligence expanded, at the end of the Second World War, the United States said, we don't want another Pearl Harbor, intelligence has to expand, but because of the nature of American government, because of the emphasis on separation of powers, checks and balances, what we've seen is a very fragmented American intelligence community. You could argue that the United States has as many as 13 or 14 different intelligence agencies. And perhaps one of the most difficult things for the United States to deal with, one of the problems it has to crunch, is the appointment of a proper director of central intelligence, someone who oversees the whole game, someone who has a team of central analysts who are able to control the whole show. Bureaucratically and politically, that's going to be very difficult to do, but it is an absolute top priority if the intelligence war against Al-Qaeda is going to be won. I think that would be my first point. I think my second point would be that the new funds that are being funneled to the intelligence agencies are valuable, but they're also problematic. Intelligence funds over the years have been overseen by congressional committees. Those committees have actually been very important in looking at abuses, looking at duplication, looking at waste in terms of the way in which intelligence communities spend their money. A lot of this new money which has been given to the intelligence agencies is not overseen by Congress, and I think that's a problem. It's being funneled to the intelligence agencies very quickly. That's good. But one of the underside of that speed is that it's not being overseen properly by Congress. It needs to be properly overseen by Congress if value for money is going to be extracted and if pressure is going to be applied to the intelligence agencies to bring forward the kinds of reforms that are required to make them really effective. I think my third point is I suppose a rather sensitive one, but I'll make it all the same. And I think the question that we're all facing, and particularly in the wake of the rather dramatic news we've had over the last 2 days about the possibility of an attack with a dirty bomb, a radiation-type weapon. Someone was arrested quite recently who seems to be associated with this kind of activity. I think the question which confronts us now really is what's going to happen to intelligence after the next attack? It's highly likely, unfortunately, that there is going to be another attack, and perhaps after that there'll be another attack. And what will intelligence, what will government, what will the balance between intelligence and our civil liberties look like after the next attack, or even after the next attack after that? This is a very painful question. It's a very difficult question, but it's a question which I guess we have to confront. And what I'd say about that is that we're now confronting some very significant choices. Western democracies have provided their populations with some remarkable benefits since 1945. Western populations have enjoyed 4 things. They've enjoyed security, they've enjoyed democracy, they've enjoyed luxury, and they've enjoyed privacy. And we've enjoyed all those things together. That has been a remarkable period in Western history. Very few Western civilizations have delivered these things to their populations. But now, as we confront a new kind of threat, a new kind of danger, I think it's going to be very hard for Western democracies to extend those kinds of benefits to its citizens. And I think, unfortunately, if there is another attack, if there's an attack after that, we're going to be asked to choose. We're going to be asked to choose which 3 of those 4 things, luxury, security, democracy, privacy, we treasure most. And I suspect that Western populations are going to say that they value luxury, that they value democracy, that they value security, but they're willing to surrender privacy. So what does the balance between intelligence and civil liberties look like 20 years on from now? I suspect we're all going to have to get used to living transparent lives. Privacy is going to mean different things. It's going to mean that our bank accounts, our email, our telephone communications are going to have to be transparent. And they're going to be transparent because that's the only way that the Western world will be able to deliver to us luxury, security, and democracy. We're probably going to have to surrender some privacy.
Any other questions for Richard Aldrich?
The central figure of organization you suggested, would that really be a liaison between the NSA and the CIA, FBI, other intelligence gathering agencies that actually have responsibilities of their own?
No, I think it wouldn't be a matter of liaison. Liaison already exists. I think it would be a matter of a controller, someone who had complete authority over all American intelligence agencies. And I think it would be very difficult. It was something that was recommended, we think, in a report by Brent Scowcroft some years ago. It's something which has been buried, and it's been buried, I think, partly because the Pentagon is now perhaps the lead player in terms of intelligence activities, and this would mean the Department of Defense perhaps surrendering control over a lot of intelligence activities. I think the Pentagon would be reluctant to do that. These changes, I think, would be very painful. They would involve a lot of people giving up a lot of turf, but a central controller is probably what the American intelligence system needs, and until it gets that central controller, in fact, it's the role which the senior person at the CIA is supposed to perform in the American intelligence community. The director of the CIA is not called the Director of the CIA. It's actually called Director of Central Intelligence. But in practice, because of political and bureaucratic pressures, he's never really been allowed to pursue that role, to perform that role. I'm not saying that the Director of the CIA is necessarily the right person, but someone in the American intelligence community needs to have not only a coordinating function, but a controlling function. Needs to be head of the whole show.
The book is called The Hidden Hand by Overlook Press. We thank you very much for coming out to Georgetown. Thank you very much for your talk. We appreciate it, and good night.
Richard Aldrich is a professor of politics at the University of Nottingham and co-editor of the journal Intelligence and National Security. The Hidden Hand, Britain, America, and Cold War Secret Intelligence is published by the Overlook Press.